So today we're going to be talking about the crises of the 14th century. A bunch of different things happened during this century. A lot. Famine happened, then war, then plague, then a revolt, and in addition, a crisis within the church. One thing after the next. During the feudal era in England, we talk about estates instead of classes. The three estates in England, the first and second and third, those who fight, those who pray, and those who farm. But there were people that did other things, obviously, besides that. Tradespeople, millers, crafters, innkeepers, etc. And during the 14th century, they became more populous and powerful because of the various things that happened. So the first thing that happened you saw described in Terry Jones's piece, it was famine. Record rainfall ends up causing a bunch of the crops to rot in the field, and people were unable to harvest, and it ended up being a really horrible famine situation. This visual is a picture depicting famine. That's what this says. This is famine, and it's being devoured by this hunger. After the famine came, then came the bubonic plague, or what people often call the Black Plague or Black Death. And that hits Europe right in the middle of the 14th century, as you can see there. Here's an example, a picture of some folks who are afflicted with the classic buboes or plague symptoms. And here you have a doctor or potentially like a wizard figure. The difference wasn't necessarily huge. And the doctor may be spraying something into the air in order to purify it. The name bubonic comes from the classic sores, or what were called buboes, on the skin. Here's another picture depicting an illness. This might be smallpox rather than plague, but here these folks, these are monks who are afflicted with whatever it is, and they're being blessed here by a priest. And it killed, depending on whoever's estimates you take, it killed between half or a third of the population. So the estimate is that it went from 4 million people to about 2.5 million people over the course of just a few years, less than a decade. And that created a labor shortage, which Terry Jones also spoke about in the piece that you saw before. In addition to the famine and the plague that Terry Jones talked about was widespread war. That was not talked about in Jones's piece. You can see that the 100 Years' War took place throughout most of the 14th century and into the 15th century, and that was between France and England. Continued fighting during all of that time. So generations of people over and over and over again fighting. But there were other things that were happening in the 14th century that weren't involving England specifically, but there was a lot of war. In Scandinavia, there was war. In Bohemia, there was war. In Eastern Europe, there was war. In Spain, there was war. And in Scotland, there was war. And if you've seen Braveheart, that's the war that's referenced there. So a lot of people are dying throughout the 14th century for a lot of different reasons. As you saw in Terry Jones's piece, the fact that so many people died off created a labor shortage. And the labor shortage resulted in various attempts of the government to control wages. There was a statute of laborers in 1351. Eventually, the situation worsened. Faced with more and more taxes, commoners, both serfs and also townspeople, rioted. There were beatings, there were murders, and they marched on London, where there was more rioting and killing, and where they got Richard II, who was 14 at the time, to agree to some of their terms, including that he declared serfdom ended. But as you also saw in Terry Jones's piece, that didn't last, and he didn't hold to the terms, and the statute of laborers was reissued. So this is a picture depicting Richard's boat, and here's the army of peasants and commoners. And here's the Tower of London in the background. Here's another depiction. Here is King Richard addressing the crowd as well. And here's the picture that Terry Jones animated in his piece, showing the murder that began it. The other thing that happened that was a huge crisis for the 14th century that affected all of Europe, all of Western Europe, was the Western Schism. So at the beginning of the 14th century, Pope Clement V moves the papacy, moves the Pope and all of the trappings of the Pope to Avignon, France, from Rome, where it had been prior and where it is now. It's in Avignon for the entire century, practically, right? Up through 1376. And then Pope Gregory XI moves it back to Rome, but dies shortly thereafter. And in the aftermath of his death, two different popes are elected, one elected in France and one elected in Italy. So you can see here the pink representation shows the Pope that was elected in Avignon, which is France, Clement. And you can see here the gray shows the Pope that was elected in Rome, so Pope Urban. There's two different popes happening then, and you can see that from 1378 on through the beginning of the 15th century, there are two popes. They held a special meeting, a special council, in order to handle the situation. And at that special council, instead of dealing with the situation, they elected a third pope, and that was at Pisa. And you can see here. So finally, once these popes all eventually end their terms, finally the papacy was reunited again under Martin, and this wasn't until 1418. So there was a good 50 years here where there were two popes. And you can imagine what this might have done to Christianity. If the head of your religion is no longer the head of your religion, now you have two heads and you don't know which person you're supposed to give loyalty to, that generates anxiety, that generates mistrust, that generates a lot of different kinds of problems. So the Great Schism then here, you can see on the map which countries allied with which of the popes. The pink is Avignon, so you can see obviously France did, and you can see most of Spain. You can see that Italy was split depending on whether it was northern Italy or southern Italy. And you can see that this purple one is Rome. So you can see England went with Rome, and you can see all the different countries. And then the ones that are both colors meant that they were split. It didn't break down so peacefully or easily. Schism that happened paved the way for what's going to be religious reform. And I'll be talking about that in a separate lesson, not today's lesson. So all of those various crises ended up causing a lot of change throughout the end of the 14th century. By the end of the century, serfdom was on the decline. It was starting to no longer be a viable system. As Terry Jones puts it, the contract was no longer in place. And there were a number of other social changes that happened as a result as well. Women gained a lot of rights and access to power. And next week, we're going to be watching another Terry Jones feature called The Damsel. You're required to watch all of it, and it addresses those social changes. Also, the merchant estate developed. A new estate of people that are involved in trade drives the development of town. And as towns develop, merchants thrive. And as trade starts to become a little bit more international and global, that means that the merchant class starts to have a lot of money. The aristocratic class, on the other hand, starts to have less money because their money is all tied up in land. And if you don't have people to work the land, then your land is far less valuable. Another effect of the war with France and a number of other developments and the crises is that English started to become a much more important language. Before that, things had happened in French or Latin in official records and courts. English started to become used in official records in guilds and then in cities and eventually in courts. So this means that we have a lot more literacy than in Middle English because all of the people who are associated with all of these official spaces are learning and utilizing Middle English instead of Latin. And as a result of that, we see a rise in Middle English literature specifically. So the literature that we've been reading from the 12th century was written in French or in Latin. But now we have authors like John Gower, William Langland, and Geoffrey Chaucer, who we're going to read, as well as the Gawain poet who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, who is an anonymous poet. But so we see a rise of Middle English literature and literature written in Middle English for English readers rather than being so beholden to the French tradition.